Humble girl is stopped from entering the school party, but when the principal discovers who her father is. Mary Harris stood before the mirror, smoothing the fabric of her simple dress. It wasn't extravagant, but it carried a quiet beauty that reflected her character, resilient, thoughtful, and unyielding in the face of the unspoken hierarchy at Oakwood High. The dress was a gift from Lisa Carter, her English teacher, who had insisted that Mary deserved to attend the senior dance as much as anyone else. "Are you sure about this?" Mary had asked earlier, her tone hesitant. Lisa had smiled warmly. "Absolutely. You belong there, Mary. Never let anyone convince you otherwise." Those words echoed in her mind as Mary walked toward the entrance of the grand ballroom, her heart a mix of nervous anticipation and quiet hope. This wasn't just a dance, it was a chance to be seen, to exist in a space where she had always felt like an outsider. As she reached the doors, the imposing figure of Vice Principal Daniel Brooks blocked her path. His eyes scanned her from head to toe, a faint sneer curling at the edge of his lips. "You can't go in, Mary," he said, his voice clipped and devoid of empathy. "This event has certain standards, and, well, let's just say your attire doesn't meet them." Mary's breath caught. She held up her invitation, the neatly printed card trembling slightly in her hand. "I have my ticket," she replied, her voice steady despite the humiliation threatening to overwhelm her. "This dress is perfectly fine." Brooks gave a derisive chuckle. "Rules are rules, Mary. I don't make exceptions." A hush fell over the nearby students as they watched the scene unfold. Some exchanged puzzled glances, others smirked, reveling in her discomfort. Mary could feel the weight of their gazes, but she refused to let them see her falter. "Let her through." The commanding voice of Jonathan Beeman, the school's director, cut through the murmurs. He stepped forward, his tall frame radiating authority. For a brief moment, hope flickered in Mary's chest, until she saw the look on his face. Beeman's expression was a blend of irritation and indifference, as though he found the situation tedious. "Mary," he began, his tone patronizing, "you're a bright student. But this event has standards for a reason. It's about presenting the school in the best possible light. Surely you understand." "Presenting the school?" Mary repeated, incredulous. "By excluding people like me?" Beeman raised a hand to silence her. "I'm sorry, but the rules are clear. You're not permitted to enter." The finality in his words hit her like a blow. Her grip on the invitation tightened, the paper crumpling under the pressure. She opened her mouth to argue again, but the lump in her throat made it impossible to speak. From a distance, Sarah Johnson watched with mounting fury. Mary's best friend and one of the most popular students in the school, Sarah had always been outspoken about injustice, and this was no exception. She stormed toward the door, her heels clicking sharply against the tiled floor. "This is ridiculous." Sarah's voice was loud enough to turn heads. "Mr. Beeman, you're seriously barring one of the most hard-working, decent students in this school because of a dress?" Beeman's expression darkened. "Ms. Johnson, this is not your concern." "Oh, it absolutely is," Sarah shot back, her green eyes blazing. "You're punishing someone for not fitting into your elitist vision of this school. Do you even realize how absurd that sounds?" Before Beeman could respond, Daniel Brooks interjected, his tone smug. "Sarah, if you have an issue, take it up with the board. Right now, we're enforcing the rules." Sarah took a step closer, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You're going to regret this." Mary gently touched Sarah's arm, her voice soft but firm. "It's okay, Sarah. Let it go." "No, it's not okay." Sarah turned to her friend, her anger giving way to frustration. "You shouldn't have to put up with this." But Mary shook her head. "I don't want to cause a scene. Let's just leave." As she walked away, the murmurs behind her grew louder. Students whispered among themselves, some outraged, others indifferent. The heavy doors of the ballroom closed, muffling the lively music and laughter inside. Mary stepped outside, her composure finally cracking as she exhaled a shaky breath. She clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. Tears stung her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "Not here. Not now." Behind her, Sarah's voice echoed faintly through the doors as she continued arguing with Beeman and Brooks. But Mary didn't turn back. She had learned long ago that the world wasn't fair, and tonight was just another reminder. Yet, as she stood under the dim glow of the streetlights, a strange certainty settled over her. This night wasn't over, not for her, and not for the people who had dismissed her so easily. Something had shifted, though she couldn't quite name it. For now, she would wait. But deep in her heart, she knew, this was only the beginning. Mary stood by the curb, clutching her small purse tightly. The whispers from earlier still echoed in her ears, each one a sting to her pride. Her shoulders slumped slightly, but her resolve to appear unaffected held firm. That resolve was tested the moment she saw the sleek, dark car pulling up to the school. The car door opened, and Michael Harris stepped out. His tailored suit was immaculate, his polished shoes clicking against the pavement as he approached with hurried strides. For all his poise, there was an edge to his expression, something between concern and irritation. "Mary," he called, his voice sharp but not unkind. "I thought you'd be inside by now." Mary stiffened. She hadn't expected to see him here tonight, and the suddenness of his appearance made her heart race. Avoiding his gaze, she muttered, "They didn't let me in." Michael stopped in front of her, his brows knitting together in confusion. "What do you mean they didn't let you in? You're on the guest list." "It's my dress," Mary admitted reluctantly, her voice barely above a whisper. Her fingers fiddled with the edge of her purse strap. "They said it wasn't good enough." For a moment, Michael said nothing. His jaw tightened, and his eyes darkened with a fury that seemed to ripple beneath his composed exterior. "Who said that?" he asked, his tone low and deliberate. "It doesn't matter," Mary replied quickly, shaking her head. "Let's just go. It's not worth making a scene." Michael's sharp gaze softened as he studied her. He could see the mix of humiliation and resignation on her face, and it stung him in a way he wasn't prepared for. But retreating wasn't an option, not now, not when someone had dared to treat his daughter this way. "No," he said firmly. "This is unacceptable." "Dad, please," Mary began, but Michael was already walking toward the school's entrance. She followed a few steps behind, torn between stopping him and letting him handle it. Part of her didn't want the attention, but another part, the part still stinging from the rejection, wanted to see what he would do. Inside, the music from the ballroom hummed faintly in the background. The sight of Michael Harris striding through the corridor turned heads. Carolyn Reed, the school secretary, looked up from her desk, her curiosity piqued by the sudden arrival of the sharp-dressed man. Michael spotted Jonathan Beeman standing near the ballroom doors, speaking quietly with Daniel Brooks. His measured pace quickened, his presence commanding attention. "Mr. Beeman," Michael called out, his voice cutting through the murmur of conversation. The director turned, surprise flashing across his face. "Mr. Harris," he greeted, quickly regaining his composure. "I wasn't expecting you tonight." "No, I don't imagine you were," Michael replied curtly. His sharp eyes flicked briefly to Daniel Brooks, who shifted uncomfortably under his gaze. Michael wasted no time. "Is it true that my daughter was denied entry to this event because of her dress?" Beeman opened his mouth, but his hesitation betrayed him. "Mr. Harris, this event has certain standards and..." "Standards?" Michael interrupted, his voice like a whip. "Since when does Oakwood High measure a student's worth by the fabric they wear?" "Now hold on," Brooks interjected, his usual smugness faltering. "It's not about worth. It's about maintaining the school's image." Michael's gaze snapped to him, and Brooks flinched under the intensity. "And excluding one of your most dedicated students from her own school dance is how you maintain that image?" Michael demanded. Beeman stepped forward, attempting to defuse the situation. "Mr. Harris, I understand you're upset, but..." "You don't understand," Michael cut in, his voice dangerously calm. "You don't understand what it feels like to see your child turned away because someone decided she wasn't good enough." Carolyn, who had been silently observing from her desk, leaned slightly closer. There was something in the way Michael spoke, an edge of personal investment that intrigued her. "Mr. Harris," Beeman began, his tone placating, "I assure you, this was not a personal slight against Mary." Michael's cold laugh echoed in the corridor. "It wasn't personal? Then what was it?" "A misguided attempt to uphold some elitist standard at the expense of a student's dignity." Brooks, clearly uncomfortable, muttered, "Perhaps this conversation would be better suited for a different time." Michael turned to him, his eyes narrowing. "You don't get to decide when this conversation happens, Mr. Brooks. Not after the message you've sent to my daughter tonight." Mary, standing a few steps away, watched the exchange in silence. Her emotions were a storm: embarrassment, gratitude, anger, and an unfamiliar sense of pride in seeing her father stand up for her so fiercely. Beeman shifted awkwardly, glancing at Carolyn, who met his gaze with an unreadable expression. She had seen enough of these interactions to know when something wasn't adding up. And tonight, something about Beeman's and Brooks's demeanor seemed calculated. "Mr. Harris," Beeman finally said, his tone clipped, "if you wish to file a formal complaint, I suggest we handle this through the appropriate channels." Michael took a step closer, his voice lowering but losing none of its edge. "Oh, I'll be filing more than a complaint. Believe me, this conversation is far from over." With that, he turned back to Mary, his expression softening as he approached her. "Let's go," he said quietly. Mary hesitated. "You didn't have to do that," she murmured. "Yes, I did," Michael replied, his tone resolute. "And I'll do it again if I have to." As they walked away, Carolyn's eyes followed them. Something about the entire exchange gnawed at her. There were pieces of this puzzle that didn't fit, and she intended to find out why. The tension simmered as Michael and Mary stepped outside, the echoes of the confrontation lingering in the air. Mary's thoughts churned with questions she wasn't sure she wanted answers to. Her father, ever the enigma, walked beside her in silence. For the first time in a long while, she felt both guarded and strangely safe. Whatever lay ahead, she sensed tonight was only the beginning. The next morning, Mary walked into school with a sense of unease. The events of the previous night replayed in her mind. The rejection, her father's sudden appearance, and the confrontation that had left everyone, including her, unsettled. She kept her head down as she moved through the hallways, avoiding the whispers that seemed to follow her every step. In the office, Carolyn Reed waited patiently, her eyes fixed on the papers spread across her desk. She had spent most of the night sifting through old records, piecing together fragments of information that had nagged at her since Michael Harris's confrontation with Beeman. The more she found, the more questions she had. When Mary knocked on the doorframe, Carolyn looked up and smiled warmly. "Mary, come in. I wanted to talk to you." Mary hesitated before stepping inside, her arms crossed defensively. "Is something wrong?" Carolyn gestured to the chair across from her. "Not wrong, exactly. But there's something I think you should know, or at least ask about." Mary sat, her brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" Carolyn leaned forward, her expression cautious. "Your father, has he ever mentioned having a connection to Oakwood High?" Mary blinked, taken aback. "No, never. Why would he?" "I'm not entirely sure," Carolyn admitted, choosing her words carefully. "But after last night, I couldn't help wondering. The way he spoke to Mr. Beeman, it wasn't just about you being turned away. It felt personal." The room fell silent as Mary processed this. Her father had always been an enigmatic figure in her life, present when it mattered most, but often shrouded in mystery. She thought about his intense reaction the night before, how his anger had seemed to go beyond the immediate injustice. "Why do you think he has a connection to the school?" Mary finally asked. Carolyn hesitated, then shrugged lightly. "Just a hunch. Maybe you should ask him." Mary nodded slowly, a swirl of curiosity and apprehension building inside her. "Thanks for telling me." That evening, Mary waited in the living room for her father to return from work. She sat on the edge of the couch, her hands clasped tightly together as she rehearsed what she wanted to say. When Michael finally walked through the door, loosening his tie, she stood abruptly. "Mary," he asked, surprised by her tense posture. "Everything okay?" "I need to ask you something," she said, her voice steady but firm. Michael raised an eyebrow, setting his briefcase down. "Of course. What's on your mind?" "Carolyn Reed mentioned something today," Mary began, searching his face for any flicker of recognition. "She asked if you had a connection to Oakwood High." Michael froze, his expression guarded. He exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. "I was wondering when this would come up." Mary's eyes narrowed. "So, it's true? You have a connection to the school?" "Yes," he admitted, his tone measured. "I'm one of its principal investors." The weight of his words hit her like a tidal wave. She stared at him, trying to reconcile this revelation with everything she thought she knew about her father. "You're an investor," she echoed, disbelief coloring her voice. "How could you not tell me something like that?" Michael sighed, stepping closer. "Because it wasn't relevant. I didn't want my involvement with the school to affect your experience there." "Not relevant." Mary's voice rose, frustration bubbling to the surface. "Dad, I was humiliated last night. If you're one of the school's biggest investors, why didn't you do something to prevent that?" "Because I wanted you to grow up without relying on privilege," Michael said firmly. "I didn't want you to be treated differently because of who I am." Mary shook her head, her emotions a whirlwind of anger, confusion, and betrayal. "So, you just let me struggle? Let me deal with people like Beeman and Brooks, who clearly think I'm not good enough." Michael placed a hand on her shoulder, his expression softening. "I never wanted you to feel this way. My intention was to teach you resilience, to help you build strength on your own terms." Mary pulled away, pacing the room. "Do you even know what it's like? To feel like you're constantly proving yourself to people who already decided you don't belong." Michael's voice dropped, heavy with regret. "I do, Mary. That's why I tried to protect you from it in my own way. But clearly, I made a mistake." The room fell silent, the tension between them palpable. Mary stopped pacing, turning to face him. Her voice was quieter now, but no less resolute. "Why did you keep it from me? The truth about your role at the school." Michael hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor. "Because I didn't want you to see me as a safety net. I wanted you to stand on your own. And, maybe I didn't want you to judge me for being part of a system that's so flawed." Mary's expression softened slightly at his admission, but the sting of his secrecy still lingered. "You could have trusted me, Dad. I'm not a little kid anymore." Michael met her eyes, a flicker of guilt crossing his face. "You're right. I should have been honest with you. And I will be, from now on." Mary crossed her arms, the weight of his words settling uneasily in her chest. "We'll see." Later that night, as Mary lay in bed, her mind raced with questions. Why had her father stayed silent for so long? And why did his connection to the school seem so complicated? Unbeknownst to her, Michael sat in his study, staring at an old photo of himself and a younger Jonathan Beeman. The cracks in their once solid partnership had long since grown into chasms, and last night's confrontation had only deepened them. But Michael knew one thing for certain: the past he had tried so hard to bury was finally catching up with him. And Mary, whether he liked it or not, was at the center of it all. Carolyn Reed had always been observant. In her years as the school secretary, she had seen countless administrative blunders, petty squabbles, and cover-ups. But something about Daniel Brooks had always seemed off. The vice principal carried himself with an air of self-importance that didn't quite match his role, and his actions the night of the dance had been the final push Carolyn needed to dig deeper. After hours of poring over old financial reports and meeting minutes, she found it a series of suspicious discrepancies. Brooks had approved inflated expenses for vague school improvements and shuffled funds between accounts without proper documentation. It didn't take much to see the pattern. Money was disappearing, and Brooks was the common denominator. The next day, Carolyn called Sarah Johnson into her office, knowing the fiery senior would be eager to help. "Sarah, I need your assistance," Carolyn began, her tone serious but calm. Sarah sat forward, intrigued. "What's going on?" Carolyn slid a file across the desk. "I found evidence that Daniel Brooks has been embezzling funds from the school. It's serious, but if we're going to stop him, I'll need someone with influence among the students to help me get the word out." Sarah flipped through the pages, her green eyes widening. "This is insane. How long has this been going on?" "For years, I suspect," Carolyn said grimly. "But we can't act on suspicions alone. This evidence is solid, but exposing him will require careful planning." Sarah frowned, her mind racing. "What do you need me to do?" "First, I need you to bring Tom Evans in on this. He's smart and level-headed, and more importantly, he knows how to keep things quiet until the time is right." Sarah nodded. "I'll talk to him after class." That afternoon, Sarah approached Tom in the library. He was hunched over a textbook, scribbling notes in the margins. "Tom," she whispered, sliding into the chair across from him. "We need to talk." Tom looked up, raising an eyebrow. "What's going on?" "Carolyn found something big, something about Brooks. But she needs our help." Tom leaned closer, lowering his voice. "What kind of something?" Sarah hesitated, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard. "She found proof that he's been stealing money from the school." Tom's eyes widened. "Are you serious?" "Dead serious," Sarah replied. "But we need to keep this under wraps for now. Carolyn's planning to present everything at the next school board meeting, and we need to make sure Brooks doesn't find out before then." Tom ran a hand through his hair, his expression skeptical. "This is risky. What if he figures out what we're doing? He could try to cover his tracks, or worse." "That's why we're being careful," Sarah assured him. Carolyn knows what she's doing, and we'll back her up. Are you in? Tom hesitated for a moment, then nodded. I'm in. The night of the school board meeting, the tension in the air was palpable. Carolyn sat near the front of the room, her files neatly organized in a folder on her lap. Michael Harris was there as well, his presence commanding respect from everyone in the room. Mary sat beside him, her expression a mix of curiosity and unease. Daniel Brooks, oblivious to the storm about to descend, sat confidently near the podium. He greeted board members with his usual smug charm, completely unaware that his carefully constructed facade was about to crumble. As the meeting progressed, Carolyn waited patiently for her moment. When the time came for administrative concerns to be addressed, she stood, her movements deliberate and composed. "Excuse me, but I have something that requires the board's immediate attention," Carolyn began, her voice steady. All eyes turned to her, including Brooks's. He frowned, his brow furrowing in suspicion. Carolyn approached the podium and handed her folder to the board president. These documents outline a series of financial irregularities tied directly to Vice Principal Daniel Brooks. "I believe the evidence speaks for itself." A murmur rippled through the room as the board members began reviewing the files. Brooks's face turned pale, then red as he stammered, This is a misunderstanding." Michael Harris stood, his expression hard. "A misunderstanding? These records show a clear pattern of theft and deceit, Mr. Brooks. Care to explain how school funds ended up in personal accounts linked to your name?" I don't know what you're talking about," Brooks protested, his voice rising. "These accusations are baseless." "Baseless?" Carolyn shot back, her voice cutting through the room. "Every transaction is documented. Your signature is on the approvals. Are you really going to deny it?" Brooks's eyes darted around the room, searching for support, but he found none. Even Jonathan Beeman, who had often turned a blind eye to Brooks's behavior, looked visibly uncomfortable. "You've been caught, Brooks," Michael said, his tone icy. "The best thing you can do now is cooperate." Brooks clenched his fists, his face contorted with anger and desperation. "This is a setup. You're all out to get me." Mary, who had been silently observing until now, leaned toward her father and whispered, "What happens if he refuses to admit it?" Michael glanced at her, his jaw tightening. "Then we let the authorities handle it." The board president cleared his throat, bringing the room to order. "Thank you, Ms. Reed. The board will review this evidence thoroughly and take the necessary action." Carolyn nodded, her expression calm but resolute. As she returned to her seat, she caught Mary's eye and offered a small reassuring smile. After the meeting, the tension finally began to dissipate. Brooks had left in a huff, but the damage to his reputation, and his career, was done. "You were incredible," Sarah said to Carolyn as they exited the building. "I just did what needed to be done," Carolyn replied. "But it's not over yet. The board still has to decide on the next steps." Mary approached them, her expression thoughtful. "Thank you for standing up to him. It means a lot." Carolyn placed a hand on Mary's shoulder. "You're the reason I did it. People like you deserve better than what this school has been offering." As they walked away, Michael lagged behind, his thoughts heavy. He had dealt with men like Brooks before, and he knew this was only the beginning of the fallout. But for Mary, the night marked a turning point. She was no longer just a passive observer in the tangled web of Oakwood High's politics. Now she was part of the fight for change, and she wasn't backing down. The reprogrammed dance carried a weight far beyond what anyone had anticipated. The Grand Hall, once a symbol of exclusivity, now held the hopes of a community grappling with the fallout of Brooks' betrayal and Beeman's failures. Tonight wasn't just about celebrating, it was about redemption, about proving that change was possible. Mary Harris stood backstage, her hands gripping the edges of a small sheet of paper. It contained the words she had agonized over for days, each line reflecting the pain, frustration, and hope she carried. She glanced out through the curtain, seeing the faces of students, parents, and teachers mingling in the softly lit room. For the first time, she felt like she belonged here, not as an outsider, but as someone whose voice mattered. Lisa Carter, her English teacher and steadfast supporter, approached her with a gentle smile. "You ready, Mary?" she asked softly. Mary let out a shaky breath. "I think so." Lisa placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to be perfect. Just speak from your heart. They'll listen." Mary nodded, her resolve strengthening. She folded the paper neatly and tucked it into her pocket. When her name was announced, a hush fell over the room. Mary stepped onto the stage, her gaze sweeping across the crowd. The podium felt like an intimidating presence before her, but as she gripped its edges, the memory of everything she had endured in recent weeks came rushing back. She took a deep breath, steadied her voice, and began. "This school has taught me a lot," she said, her words clear and steady despite the lump in her throat. Not all of it was in the classroom. A ripple of quiet murmurs spread through the audience. Mary continued, her tone growing stronger. "It taught me how hard it can be to feel like you belong when the world around you says you don't. How people will judge you based on what you wear, where you come from, or what you don't have. And how, sometimes, those judgments come from the very people who are supposed to help you succeed." She paused, her eyes locking with Jonathan Beeman, who sat near the front. His face was flushed, his posture stiff. "But it also taught me something else," Mary went on. "It taught me that the value of a person isn't found in their clothes or their status. It's found in their character, in the way they treat others, and in the courage they show when standing up for what's right." The silence in the room was absolute now. Even the faint whispers had stopped, replaced by an almost palpable sense of attention. Mary's voice softened, but the conviction in her words remained. "When I was turned away from this dance the first time, I felt ashamed. Not because of my dress, but because I let myself believe, for even a second, that I wasn't enough. But I realized something important. My worth doesn't come from what I wear. And neither does yours." She looked out at her classmates, her voice rising again. "This school has the potential to be better. To be a place where every student feels seen, valued, and supported, no matter who they are or what they have. That's the school I want to be a part of. And I hope it's the school all of us will fight for." Applause began softly, but quickly swelled into a standing ovation. Mary stepped back, overwhelmed by the sea of clapping hands and smiling faces. When the applause finally subsided, Jonathan Beeman rose from his seat. He approached the stage slowly, his face a mix of embarrassment and determination. Taking the microphone, he cleared his throat. "Mary," he began, his voice wavering slightly. "You've shown more courage and grace than I could have expected from any student, or any adult for that matter. What happened before, under my leadership, was wrong. And I take full responsibility for that." The crowd watched, captivated, as Beeman straightened his posture. "I give you my word, this school will be different. We will be different. Changes are already underway, and I promise to do everything in my power to ensure that Oakwood High becomes a place where every student feels they belong." The room erupted into another round of applause, but Mary noticed something different in Beeman's expression. It wasn't just regret, it was resolve. As the event wound down, Mary found herself surrounded by friends and strangers alike, each offering their congratulations and gratitude. "Mary, that was amazing," Sarah said, pulling her into a tight hug. "You've changed everything." Tom Evans appeared at her side, his usual quiet demeanor replaced with an uncharacteristic enthusiasm. "You were incredible. I don't think anyone will ever forget what you said tonight." "Thanks, Tom," Mary said, smiling. Nearby, Michael Harris watched his daughter with pride. For the first time, he saw not just the young girl he had worked so hard to protect, but a confident, determined young woman making her own mark on the world. "Dad," Mary called, walking over to him. "Did you hear what Beeman said? Do you think he means it?" Michael placed a hand on her shoulder. "He'd better. Because now, the whole school is watching." Mary nodded, a quiet smile spreading across her face. For the first time in a long time, she felt hopeful, not just for herself, but for everyone at Oakwood High. The echoes of her speech lingered in the hall long after the night ended. For Mary, this wasn't the conclusion of her story. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one where her voice, and the voices of others like her, could no longer be ignored. The aftermath of the reprogrammed dance was felt across Oakwood High. Daniel Brooks was officially dismissed, escorted out of the school's administrative office in silence as staff and students looked on. His usual smug confidence was gone, replaced by a haunted expression. The ripple effects of his actions, and their exposure, had shaken the school to its core. Jonathan Beeman, though spared the same fate, faced the monumental task of rebuilding trust. True to his word, he began implementing sweeping reforms. Dress codes were re-evaluated, funding was allocated for underprivileged students, and an advisory council was established, including both students and teachers, to ensure transparency in decision-making. For Mary Harris, these changes felt like a small but meaningful victory. Each reform symbolized not only progress but also the strength of her voice, a voice she had discovered and wielded when it mattered most. One evening, Mary sat at the kitchen table, flipping through a stack of papers. Scholarship applications, letters from colleges, and notes from teachers filled the pile. Her father, Michael Harris, entered the room, carrying 2 mugs of tea. "Still working?" he asked, setting one mug in front of her. Mary looked up and smiled. "There's so much to do. I'm trying to decide which scholarships to apply for first." Michael sat across from her, his expression thoughtful. "You know, I've been thinking about something," he began. Mary raised an eyebrow. "What is it?" "I've been in talks with the school board," Michael said, leaning forward. "I want to start a scholarship fund, one that will help students like you, who have the drive and determination but not always the resources." Mary blinked, her hands stilling on the papers. "A scholarship fund?" "In your name," Michael continued. "It would be a way to ensure that what happened to you never happens to anyone else. To give other students the opportunities they deserve." Her eyes widened. "Dad, that's incredible." Michael smiled. "It's the least I can do. You've inspired so many people, Mary, including me. This is my way of carrying that forward." Mary's voice softened. "Thank you. It means a lot." A few days later, Mary was walking through the school hallways when Tom Evans caught up with her. "Hey," he called, jogging to her side. "Hey, Tom," she replied with a smile. "What's up?" Tom scratched the back of his neck, looking slightly awkward. "I heard about the scholarship fund your dad's setting up. That's pretty amazing." Mary nodded. "It feels surreal, honestly. I never imagined something like this would come out of everything that happened." Tom stopped walking, turning to face her. "You know, none of this would have happened without you. You changed the way people think about this school, about each other." She tilted her head, her smile turning shy. "I didn't do it alone. You, Sarah, Carolyn, my dad. It was all of us." "Maybe," Tom said, his grin widening. "But you were the spark. And the world needs more people like you, Mary." Her cheeks flushed slightly as she laughed. "Thanks, Tom. That means a lot." Tom shrugged, his gaze sincere. "It's true. And whatever comes next, I know you'll handle it." Mary looked at him for a moment, her smile steady. "I'm ready for whatever comes next." Months passed, and the changes at Oakwood High continued to take shape. The scholarship fund was officially announced, bearing Mary's name, and the first recipients were celebrated in a special assembly. Teachers like Lisa Carter and Carolyn Reed continued to mentor students with renewed purpose, and even Beeman, humbled by his mistakes, became an advocate for inclusivity and fairness. For Mary, life moved forward. She stood on the threshold of a future she had once doubted was possible, armed with the lessons she had learned and the strength she had discovered within herself. Her story wasn't just her own anymore. It had become a testament to the power of resilience and the impact one voice could have when it dared to speak out. As she looked toward the horizon, Mary knew that this was only the beginning. The world was waiting, and she was ready to meet it.
If you've made it this far, then subscribe to the channel and leave a comment.